So welcome everyone. We can see that everyone is joining the webinar, and so we're going to just give everybody a few more seconds. But welcome to the University of Queensland, Chinese University of Hong Kong webinar on the ethics of health during a global pandemic. We have an incredible panel and an amazing discussion that awaits this evening. And so I am going to kick off so that we don't lose too much time, but I'm sure that others will continue to join us. So my name is Jessica Gallagher, and I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement and Entrepreneurship at the University of Queensland. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us for this virtual panel discussion, bringing together experts from both UQ and CUHK to share expertise on the ethics of health during a global pandemic. I know that we have people that are joining us from around the globe, but as many of us are based in Australia, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianships of the lands on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders and descendants. I also acknowledge Professor Francis Chan, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and Professor Jeff McCall, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at UQ, our moderators for today's discussion. I also acknowledge UQ and CUHK colleagues, students, and all the panelists that are joining us online this afternoon, this evening. It's a great pleasure to be able to provide a short opening address at today's ethics webinar as a follow-on to the inaugural Health Engineering Symposium held in August this year. In planning this event, we've been heartened to see so many passionate scholars across diverse fields tackling the important ethical considerations arising from the global pandemic. We know that UQ and CUHK have always adopted the highest standards of research ethics and have built strong reputations for excellence for teaching and research integrity. This hard-earned reputation lies with the work of individual researchers, staff, and students. At a time of global crisis and in turning our minds to recovery, it's vital to clarify the key values and principles that will guide us in the many difficult decisions that we need to make. The COVID-19 pandemic is spreading more rapidly than our healthcare resources can handle and presents serious ethical challenges. These in turn are complicated by the diverse health systems and unique cultural and socio-economic contexts that exist around the globe. Consequently, there is a need for guidance to ensure that ethical conduct of research, decision-making in clinical care, and public health policy making at every level of the global COVID-19 response. The theme of today's webinar mirrors this, and we all share many of the same challenges around healthcare needs, access to care, vaccines, health and social inequalities, and the impact on vulnerable groups. There is a lot that we can learn from one another, and I personally am looking forward to the discussions from our panelists later on. This webinar is also an opportunity to build on the strong existing ties that exist between the University of Queensland and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And we hope to continue to deepen this engagement through a series of research symposiums planned in 2021, where hopefully we'll have an opportunity to meet again in person. We have a very strong panel today comprising researchers, scientists, and philosophers from both institutions. They will share with you their insights on the present situation, short to long-term issues for biomedical research, as well as opportunities and challenges that they see for the future. I'd like to thank all that have contributed to today's program. I will now hand over to Professor Jeff McCall, Executive Dean of our Faculty of Medicine, to provide a brief overview of the COVID situation and issues that are arising in Australia. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Jess, and I join with you and welcome everybody to this webinar, and also reinforcing the important relationship between the two universities and in the past and going forward. I also do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting at the moment and pay my respects to elders past and present. So just to give a bit of a brief idea of kind of COVID in Australia, and many of the panelists here today will be able to do this much better than me, so this will be a clumsy rheumatological view perhaps. When we first met the dilemma of the infection from SARS-CoV-2, I think there was a sense in the community of a kind of shared response. It was flatten the curve, i.e. control the patient load that was heading towards our health system. And I think the response in the community was an interesting one, was a mixture of kind of educative things. There was probably a sense of camaraderie and a sense of common purpose. And in fact, as a result of the measures taken in Australia, that curve was flattened. There wasn't particular stressors on the system, but at the time, there were discussions about how we would manage if we needed to ration intensive care unit positions, if we were looking at a limited amount of therapeutics in this area and so on. We then perhaps settled back, globally and in Australia to try to, what is sort of phase 2 of COVID, which is where you're going to get flare-ups from time to time. And the majority of Australia was still constrained around, we're very much a federation at the moment. The borders are not porous, and many of us before we went on this webinar were discussing how we can't actually move around to see friends and loved ones as a result of these restrictions and also mandatory hotel quarantine. So more recently, we've had a growth in cases in Victoria, mainly in Melbourne, as a result of some super spreader events that did result in a second wave. And look, I think the sampling I've made of the response to the community in Victoria was perhaps less positive than the first time. That sense of camaraderie was perhaps lost, and I think we're seeing, in what is a complex environment for individuals, an escalating concern around mental health disorders, that sort of lack of connection. There were restrictions and curfews, which are all slightly coming out now. Now, that response has worked well, and Victoria is now heading back towards very low daily numbers. And again, the hospital system was not particularly stretched. I mean, certainly there was a greater number of cases. And as has been the case globally, more of the second wave seemed to be in younger individuals. But in addition, in Victoria, there were a number of clusters around aged care, which were particularly problematic. So I think the last 6 months has been a time of extraordinary reflection for all of us, the way we work, the way our families work, how we're talking about something that really has global reach, a quite unprecedented event. And that naturally brings us into a series of kind of ethical dilemmas, and we will be exploring these tonight. But I suppose from the Australian perspective, we didn't need to move down, as they did in Italy, towards a consideration of rationing of some of our healthcare services, but there was a discussion about it. The consequences of containment and the various models and the balancing between effects of that containment, effects on the on the budget of the country versus obviously the effects on managing infection. And I think the other interesting discussion we had was around rapid deployment of therapeutics. Is there a short circuit to allow things? And obviously we've seen in the US, a sense that a president is probably willing to short circuit some of the normal ethical and scientific processes that go around. So I think that's a sort of a bit of a summary of where we're at. I think we've been very lucky in Australia overall. We have had a strong public health response. It's interesting that people know what an epidemiologist is now, and they actually know who the chief medical officer is of every state and Australia, which they probably wouldn't have known otherwise. So that has been substantially different. So I'll introduce our panelists from UQ who are going to assist us in 3 broad questions and then questions from the audience. So the first is Professor Deborah Brown, who's Professor from the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences here at UQ. Our second panellist is Associate Professor Andrew Crowden, who's an Associate Professor in Philosophy, again in the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at UQ. Dr. Melanie Janssen, a Staff Specialist in the Paediatric Intensive Care Unit at the Children's Hospital at Westmead and has a long and passionate interest in ethics. And Dr. Kirsty Short, Australian Research Fellow from the School of Chemistry and Molecular Biosciences in the Faculty of Sciences at the University of Queensland. So I think we've got a breadth of knowledge and experience in this group, which I think will be helpful. So I'll now hand over to Francis.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. First of all, I would like to thank our colleagues from the University of Queensland. In particular, I would like to thank Dr. Gallagher for kind of orchestrating and kind of make this very interesting event possible. And of course, my old friend, Dr. McCall, and all my new friends from University of Queensland. Before introducing my colleagues from CUHK, I was asked to give a very brief overview of the situation in Hong Kong, and in particular, how the Faculty of Medicine at CUHK kind of react to or contribute to COVID-19 in our locality. So if I may, I would like to kind of share my screen, kind of very short PowerPoint with you. Let me see. Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Now, first of all, this is the picture taken from one of the busiest parts of Hong Kong last week. And you can see there's a lot of people on the streets and almost everyone is wearing a surgical mask. I believe not only because of policy, but because of public awareness that really helped contain COVID-19 in Hong Kong. Remember, some 17 years ago, we had the painful experience of the SARS outbreak. And that's, to me, the major reason why we can still contain this very deadly problem. This is one of the studies we did some time ago showing that we are like Australia and some other Asian countries, that we are able to have a relatively low mortality related to COVID-19. Definitely, COVID-19 is dangerous and deadly, but we believe nothing could really deter us from moving forward. And we discussed among ourselves back in January when this pandemic came to Hong Kong. What should we do as a medical school? How should we react to this new infection? So we decided that, first of all, we need to protect our staff and students. And this is my conference room that was being converted into a storage room for surgical masks and PPEs to be distributed to my colleagues. I have to thank my colleagues who tried their very best to source different possible supplier for these essential materials for our staff and students. And because of the importance of medical education, we decided that we should not be shut down or slowed down because of this pandemic. And therefore, at the time, we formed a rapid response team led by a dedicated team of colleagues from the Office of Medical Education who had first-hand experience from the SARS outbreak in 2003. We believe social distancing is important, but not academic distancing. And therefore, to date, we have organized more than 1,000 online classes, lectures, tutorials, and flipped classrooms for our students and junior doctors. And this is how we conducted our professional examination for our final year medical students, both the clinical as well as the written examination. It was done smoothly, and we really want to thank our hardworking colleagues who make things happen without any hiccups. Certainly, the outbreak has kind of disrupted a lot of research activities, but at the same time, we also kind of make use of this pandemic to identify new research opportunities. For example, we are very lucky in working on the metagenomics of the gut microbiome and found that, say, SARS COVID-19 patients had severe dysbiosis, and we were able to develop a new microbiome replacement formula which could potentially restore dysbiosis and boost immunity against COVID-19 infection. And we are also very much interested in stool tests. While the whole world is focusing on respiratory samples, we believe stool test has its place. And because of that, we volunteer to run free tests of the stools for young children and infants coming into the Hong Kong International Airport. In the last few months, we have performed over 2,500 stool tests for asymptomatic children, and the positive rate is something like 0.2%. And some of our colleagues are very proactive. They kind of work with international professional societies to develop new guidelines to continue the clinical service and to protect our staff and students in different disciplines and kind of publish their international guidelines. So in summary, I believe we are very cautious about this pandemic, but we believe we are kind of dancing with the disease, and we would like to work with our colleagues, international partners, to make things happen and try to further develop our international collaboration and further to enhance our medical education for our staff and students. So with that, I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce our speakers from CUHK. First of all, we have Dr. Derek Au, who is Director, CUHK Center for Bioethics. We have Professor Roger Chung, who is also a staff and Associate Director, CUHK Institute of Health Equity. And last but not least, we have Professor C.T. Hong, who is Professor of Practice in Health Services Management of the Jockey Club School of Public Health and Primary Care. So I would like to stop here and then pass the time to my colleague Jeff again.
Thanks, Francis. And it's interesting when you're talking about stool cultures, one of the things around the world that's been of great testing has been testing sewerage in countries. And so just recently, one of our northern towns, Townsville, had a positive COVID test in the sewerage system. And what do you do with that information? Oh, Kirsty might be able to tell us the answer to that, but that's a complicated one. So what we're going to move to now is we've got three, quite chunky subjects, and we've allocated some speakers to the first two, and then we're going to be perhaps a little bit more fluid for the third one. So I'm going to perhaps coordinate the first and the first question. So this question is, the global pandemic affects everyone, but not everyone equally. The elderly and vulnerable face a direct health risk, others an indirect health risk, and some groups bear more of the social and economic fallout than others. What humanitarian dilemmas arise for decision and policy makers in a pandemic like this? And are there guiding ethical principles that could be relied upon to justify the decisions taken? So we've got three speakers, each have got 5 minutes to address this rather large and complex question. And we start with Deborah Brown.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honour to be with you all tonight. I too have learnt what an epidemiologist is. I'm just not sure I could spell it. But anyway, I'll try to stick to my 5 minutes. So the question of what we should do in a pandemic is essentially a normative question. There's no way to settle it just on the basis of facts alone. We have to consider what we value and develop an ethical framework to guide decision making. Now, what I'm going to do now is to actually consider one ethical framework, the utilitarian framework, and one which I don't agree with. If I have time, I'll say a few things about what I think is probably a more promising framework. So I've said that, values are most important, but facts are not irrelevant. And we know from COVID-19 that it affects different groups differently and different countries differently, some more adversely than others. We know it primarily affects elderly people. And the data from the US shows us that if you're Black, Indigenous, Pacific Island, or a Latino, you're more likely to die from COVID than if you're white or Asian. In the UK, similar data shows that almost a third of deaths from COVID are from non-whites, even though non-whites make up only 13% of the population. In Australia, we haven't been so good at collecting race and ethnicity data, but we do know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander patients, the median age is about 10 years lower than a non-Indigenous person. And we also know that low socioeconomic groups have, are more likely to have chronic underlying health conditions, more likely to be subject to overcrowding, being outside the knowledge economy, have less opportunity to work from home and socially distance, and so are inequitably affected compared to other people. So the question about what to do ethically around COVID from a decision-making perspective, it's a problem for distributive justice, right? I mean, how should the resource distribution go? And there's also this sort of general question that's been getting a lot of airplay recently. Should we lock down or should we have locked down? And this has really shaped the discussion in a particular way, where people have started to ask the question, what are we prepared to pay to save a life? And the first point to notice about this question is that we don't value life per se, but the quality of life. And one way that you might think about the difference here is to ask yourself whether you would prefer to have 20 years in a terminal coma or 2 years in good health and then die. Most people would probably prefer the 2 years. So it's not life per se that we value, but quality of life. And this is reflected in welfare economics and in economic decision making in Australia as well. In that most decision making is based around the question, not what will prolong life per se, but what will prolong a QALY, or a quality adjusted life year. And a QALY, that's QALY, if you haven't heard this term before, is a function of morbidity, an assessment of quality life on a scale between 0 death, and perfect health 1, multiplied by mortality, which is the number of years of life gained. And it's used in decision making to justify choosing one intervention over another, right? If one intervention yields a higher rate of return in terms of QALYs, then it's preferable to the other. Now, some economists in Australia, and Gigi Foster, professor at UNSW, University of New South Wales, has been very prominent in this area, have really tried to generate a sort of economic rationalist argument that lockdown isn't justified. So Foster argues in the following way: suppose that what a government is prepared to pay is $100,000 per QALY. That's actually a very generous estimate. In Australia, it's probably more like 50,000. Then what's the average loss per death from COVID-19? She estimates it's about 5 QALYs, and that too is probably generous, because if we look at the Swedish data, the life expectancy of most of the individuals there who have died is much lower than 5 quality life years. So now suppose that locking down in Australia has saved us 10,000 lives. That's 50,000 QALYs, or $5 billion. Now she calculates, right, 1 month of lockdown has cost the economy $11 billion, which is a net loss of $5 billion when you subtract the QALYs gained. However, the second month of lockdown is another $11 billion, but no QALY saved. So that's just a flat out $11 billion cost. Now, in an ideal world, we wouldn't count the cost, but we have finite resources. So the utilitarian argument, which has been defended by some ethicists like Professor Julian Savulescu, picks up on this and argues that, well, COVID-19 primarily affects elderly people. That reduces the QALY count of an open economy. And if we lock down, if we close the economy, the cost per QALY far exceeds what governments would normally pay for their health interventions. So the estimation in the US, depending on the size of the stimulus package and how many people actually die, is estimated to be possibly as high as $2.5 million per QALY, which is, way out of sync with our normal, $50,000 to $100,000 range. So given finite resources, the utilitarian argues that we should not lock down, right? Because the utilitarian is primarily interested in maximizing utility for the greatest number. Okay, so my problem with the utilitarian argument is that if we go back to that original context where we have vast inequalities in how COVID affects people, a QALY-based decision-making process is only going to compound and entrench those social inequalities. If you're Black, Indigenous, elderly, disabled, etc., your expected QALY utility is bound to count for less than if you're white, younger, or middle class. Why? Because you have a lower quality of life or you have a shorter life expectancy. So my analysis of this is the problem with this kind of QALY-based reasoning in relation to COVID is that such reasoning has an implicit ceteris paribus clause built into it, right? All else being equal, if intervention A brings you a higher yield in terms of QALY than intervention B, then you should choose A. But the trouble with COVID is that things are not all equal, right? And so in a global pandemic, ceteres we say are not pares. If we value social equality, then we need a different ethical framework for decision-making and public policy. And I can't develop that too much here, but I do think we need to bring in principles of distributive justice. I think in particular, we need a notion of public reason, according to which public policies have to be made acceptable to all those whom they affect, right, including the elderly. And also we need to bring to bear Rawls's difference principle, which would advocate that inequalities can only be justified if they make the worse off better off. And in this kind, given the social inequalities around COVID, the utilitarian response is not the appropriate one. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. It's always good to have QALYs in there. I spent a lot of time on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee looking at QALYs, and you're quite right. 50 grand per QALY was where we got. So our next discussion, and look, if we could try and keep it to 5 minutes, because otherwise we're going to probably not get to our third question. Roger Chung.
Hi. So I'm Roger Chung from CUHK, School of Public Health and Primary Care. I'm a trained social epidemiologist, but I also take this lens of ethics and justice when I'm looking at the problems, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about health of the public, ethical consideration of what is right and what is wrong are central to achieving the goals of public health. And I think we all agree to that. And I believe we can also all agree to the fact that the various public health related laws and measures and policies in place in combating COVID-19, they were all implemented with the primary purpose of health protection and disease prevention. I think we can all agree to that. And it can be argued that this primary purpose of health protection and disease prevention that is commonly taken to instantiate the goal of public health is broadly, I would like to use this word again here, utilitarian in nature. But the way that I'm using it is going to be a little bit different from how Deborah was using it. I'm not sticking $ to it. I'm not using QALY. And I would like to acknowledge that there are other utilitarian accounts that seek to recognize other forms of non-health related outcomes as being utilitarian, like, liberty, justice, and fairness. Sometimes they would be put in the utilitarian kind of context, but this is not what I'm trying to do here. So what I'm trying to say is achieving health, minimizing harm, that is broadly utilitarian in nature. And there are other important non-utilitarian ethical considerations that are also relevant when we're talking about combating COVID-19. And they are liberty and autonomy of actions, privacy, confidentiality, transparency and disclosure of important information, trust building, commitment keeping, and last but not least, the topic of the question 1, justice, fairness, and equity, right? And we have to balance all these out. And conflicts do arise among all these different ethical considerations at times, and we see that a lot already. And that's why we have all these debates, right? Now, so in effect, when such a utilitarian objective of health protection and disease prevention is regarded as the incontestable and the single most important one worth pursuing, other non-utilitarian ethical considerations would probably be heavily truncated, in turn adversely affecting the rights and the liberty and, you know, justice and fairness of the people at stake. And therefore, I believe a public health ethics framework that tries or at least attempts to resolve these potential conflicts between the so-called utilitarian and the non-utilitarian ethical considerations is much needed. And today I would like to share just one slide, actually, that I've made. Because I've actually written an OPC in the American Journal of Bioethics just 3 months ago. It's called Using a Public Health Ethics Framework to Unpick Discrimination in COVID-19 Responses, where I have taken reference to actually an old framework of public health ethics developed by James Childress and his colleagues, including Ruth Faden in 2002, that specifically proposed 5 essential justificatory conditions to help determine whether the utilitarian objective of promoting public health warrants overriding the other utilitarian values like liberty and confidentiality and justice and equity in particular cases. So we can try to apply this to particular cases like, you know, whether we're debating about mask wearing in public places, whether we should make it mandatory or screening or lockdown, economic lockdown, school lockdown, so on and so forth. So that's something that I was trying to do in this article here. But in the interest of time, I would just like to go through that 5 justificatory conditions. And maybe we can come back to this later when we're having our Q&A. Number 1, obviously that's the most obvious, is effectiveness. You know, whether that strategy, that measure is actually effective in protecting public health. And if it's not effective, it's out of the question, basically. Number 2 is proportionality, whether the probable benefits toward public health outweigh the harms that it did. Number 3 is necessity, or sometimes it's called essentiality. And I like this condition a lot because I think it's one of the most important ones, because it's asking this question. The question is whether there is any alternative strategy that is less morally troubling that could be available. So let's take lockdown as an example. If we're just talking about lockdown, are we missing half of the picture? Maybe we should do lockdown with, you know, accompanied with other strategy that helps out, that takes into account social determinants of health, that takes into account health equity and helps out the people who are more disadvantaged socially and economically speaking. Right? So if we're not doing the second part and we're only talking about lockdown, maybe we're missing a whole half of the picture at least. Now, and when all these proposed strategies satisfy the first 3 conditions, least infringement, which is talking about the infringement of the general ethical considerations should be minimized still, even when you've decided that you have to do this. And last but not least, the responsibility for the agents to implement the strategy, to explain, to the public. And I'm not sure if my time is up, but I would just like to introduce this framework, taking reference to James Childress and Ruth Vaden public health ethics framework from 2002, and we can try to apply this to what's going on right now. And even though the approach that I'm taking is different from what Deborah was talking about, it is no coincidence that the conclusion can be very similar, that we need to take into account social determinants of health and health equity in order to really address COVID-19, in order to really reduce the health inequalities that is amplified and exposed by this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. And I wonder whether these principles have been applied or discussed in our corridors of power, because I look at some of those and wonder about almost every aspect of that. Perhaps communication we've had a lot of communication. So our final speaker on this broad question is Melanie Janssen.
Thanks so much, Jeff. So I was involved in a lot of the writing of the rationing guidelines for the intensive care rationing that would happen or may need to happen during COVID-19. And for me, it was interesting because, as many people have said now, everybody knows what an epidemiologist is and who the chief health minister is. I think while I'm sure most people knew what an intensive care specialist was, I think the public now have a really strong insight into the day-to-day activities of intensive care and the rationing that can need to happen. And what I thought was one of the positive things coming out of COVID is that it has forced the world to realise that explicitly rationing at the bedside is required. At least people have decided that it's required during a pandemic anyway. So the main principles that have been operationalised in the space for intensive care rationing, which is something that really came to the forefront during the pandemic, is that people have generally focused on the principles of procedural justice. And of course, all the different rationing tools are a little bit different, but broadly, people have said that the principles we should base them on are sort of a mix of the utilitarian and deontological things. So the principles that have often been stated are that we should acknowledge that all people are of equal value in and of themselves, but that we have an obligation as a society to get the most out of the resources that we have. And we also should probably give priority to those who are in need. So they're sort of broad principles underlying it. And then people have then focused on the idea of procedural justice, because everybody knows that reasonable people can disagree with how to prioritise different principles to make a final rationing decision. So a lot of the hospitals and area health services intensive that have made rationing things have tried to adhere to the principles of procedural justice, such that they're made public, that they're relevant and have a good rationale, a reasonable rationale for the decision is made, and that there's an appeals process and that there's a mechanism for enforcement. So, for example, a lot of them will say that we need to define a switch, at which point we go from our usual practice of deciding on how resources are allocated based on clinical need, that we switch into a time of resource scarcity. And then the first question that we've often asked is, step one, is the patient eligible to come to ICU? So people who aren't eligible for ICU are people who don't need it, people who don't want it, and people who won't benefit from it. So you have to exclude those people. And then there's the task of prioritising, and many clinical tools have been made to try and medically prioritise the people that are coming into ICU. There's been a lot of discussion within that of intensivists medically prioritise people to come into ICU every day of the week. So that bit was not foreign to them. But then when we thought we're in times of real scarcity, there's other things that we'll have to take into account. And those are more value-based things. Like, is it okay to say that we should prioritise younger people based on the fact that they have fewer life years left and have had less opportunity to live through life stages? Should we prioritise healthcare workers somewhat because they need to get back to work against the pandemic, and perhaps we should say that there's a degree of reciprocity for them putting themselves at risk looking after the rest of the population. Interestingly, there's an intensive care specialist who did a PhD a few years ago who's Australian, Winston Chung, and he did a cross-sectional survey of Australian and New Zealand populations where he actually asked people, how do you think that we should ration during a pandemic? And he put, a scenario to them that was a global pandemic of influenza. And he said, how do you think we should ration? And the options that people were given were to use a first come, first served approach, to let a senior doctor decide, to use a set of criteria that have been determined by a health department, to use random selection, to use ability to pay, or to use the importance of the patient to decide. And interestingly, it came back of that survey of nearly 700 people across Australia and New Zealand, randomly selected through the Electoral Commission, that in Australia, most people said, well, we'd just like a senior doctor to decide, or we would be happy for it to be done based on previous criteria set by the health department. And in New Zealand, they, again, at the top of their list was to let a senior doctor decide. I must admit that surprised me because I've grown up in the era where medical paternalism is not considered the right thing to do. Interestingly, also in the survey, they found that most people in the community thought that age was actually an okay way to ration in that setting, and that chronic comorbidity and predicted mortality are also reasonable. But there's been a huge amount of discussion about age discrimination and about disability discrimination in this space, and I think that's been a really healthy thing for the community to do. And I think a lot of the triage tools have tried to incorporate that in a very thoughtful way, and if anything, have only used things like age, being a healthcare worker, as a tiebreaker. If clinically things being equal, we need to tie break in some way. The other thing that I'd like to just draw people's attention to that was particularly important in Australia was that there was a lot of talk about how to ration ICU. And in Australia, we never got to that point because we had still huge capacity of ICU, even at the height of the pandemic in different states. And what we've actually noticed, particularly in the paediatric setting where I work, is the collateral damage from stopping elective surgery, stopping outpatient clinics, making people do things by telehealth. And that we had, for example, in the months of the pandemic, we had a lot of late presentations of leukemia. We had a lot of perforated appendices. We had huge, increased reporting of children at risk at home because of the stress that families were under. And I think that really exposed how vulnerable some groups are, and that I think we really needed to look at all this preparation that we're doing for the pandemic. When it is becoming clearer that we're controlling it reasonably well, that we actually needed to look at the damage that we were doing for these really, really stringent pandemic restrictions that we were doing in the healthcare sector and elsewhere. So I think the key things in summary for me are that procedural justice principles have been at the forefront of healthcare rationing at the coalface. And I think it's actually very positive that bedside rationing has been brought into the forefront. And what I would like to come from this in the future is that people realise that we actually do bedside rationing all of the time and not just in a pandemic. And we could use some of these principles to make those processes more just on an everyday basis.
Thanks, Melanie. And that, the specificity of that discussion. And I remember when Italy was at its worst phase, and in Northern Italy, these were the discussions, and I think there was definitely an age-related criteria that was being applied, but it did stimulate some very interesting discussions, and would have been a fascinating thing to be with your ICU colleagues to work out where they were sitting. But you're quite right, we ration things all the time in the health system, all the time, and we ration, often the rationing is controlled by money, so it's interesting. So look, I think we're getting really strong and rich discussions. I think, Francis, we might do just 2 questions rather than the 3, and then go to the questions at the end, and that'll allow this next section to be as full as this first one. So thank you to the first 3 speakers, and I'll hand over to Francis.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Well, I guess we should move on to another issue concerning vaccines. As the race for a COVID vaccine is in full swing, when we consider if the development may have compromised the ethical and scientific standards for research and development. The question is, what can be done in the short term to safeguard the process, and in the longer term, what ethical framework should be put in place to ensure that rapid response vaccine development does not really violate fundamental ethical principles of biomedical research? And I would like to hear from our panelists, including Professor C.T. Hong, Professor Andrew Proden, Dr. Derek Au, and last but not least, Dr. Kirsty Short. Now, we have 4 panel members, so I very much hope that you will observe time, and each one will be given 5 minutes. Can we start with CT first?
Okay, thank you, Francis, for the introduction. Now, there are different issues at different stages of the vaccine trials. So it could be related to the exploitation of the vulnerable population, or not having enough diversity of subjects so that the generalization of results will be doubtful. I want to focus on the human challenge study today, because you know that when we are doing vaccine studies, usually it will take years to complete. And after the volunteer has been given the vaccine, they will have to wait for a natural infection to occur. Now, even in endemic areas, that could take a long process. And the human challenge study is the deliberate administration of virus to those who have received the vaccine. It will certainly lead to faster results, involving lesser subjects, and probably able to select the most promising or effective vaccine. And of course, it has been used in previous trials like influenza, malaria, typhoid, under strict oversight of research ethics committee. And high research standards are usually required when they involve healthy individuals. Now, the concern with human challenge study is that the early history of the human challenge study is not that outstanding. Of course, in the last 2 decades, the results have been very promising. And in the research ethics, we know that autonomy is very important. And apart from autonomy, there are 2 other aspects, namely strict limits of harm, and the welfare of individuals should be given more weight than that of the society. So there are 2 main ethical concerns with the human challenge test. Firstly, whether it is wrong to infect a healthy adult with a disease-causing virus. Now, here it is more than good intention and possible consequences, as these individuals will be monitored closely for any adverse effects. Secondly, it's about the risk of harm. Now, in all research ethics, we should not introduce harm to the subject. However, despite the fact that we may be giving the virus to a healthy subject, and despite the fact we know that it should be safe, but there is still a risk that it could lead to some harm, or certainly there is a low risk of mortality as well. So that harm itself is not insignificant. And the long-term effects of the virus or the infection on lung is not known. So these are actually quite different from the scenario we talk about for typhoid or for malaria. There are other arguments against human challenge study, including the Kantian's second categorical imperative, namely as a means to an end. And also it may be impossible for an individual to truly give informed and free consent when the society benefit to human challenge test is so great. Proponents of human challenge test would, of course, use a utilitarian perspective, the word we have heard many times today, to say that potential benefits to a large number of people from a quicker developed vaccine would outweigh that of likely harms caused to a smaller number of people. Now, this contradicts to our earlier ethical principle. And also, people would say that it is morally praiseworthy to participate in a study where the anticipated benefits to others is greater than the potential harm to our own self. However, the important issue again here is the ability of the person to give valid and informed and rigorous consent in a sacrificial, self-determinative way. More guidance would be needed. Now here comes the guidance. WHO has come up with the 8 criteria in doing challenge study, of course, we have to look at the scientific justification, namely that there will be large public health benefit to inform selection of vaccine. Second important thing is about risk assessment. We should be able to quantify the benefits as well as the risk, and on balance, the benefit would outweigh the risk. And of course, we have to look at the risk to participant, to the society, as well as the third-party context. They all should be considered, and risk minimization procedures should be in place, and it should only involve the healthy adults, and the curative treatment, although it's not available at present, should be available in future. And either attenuated or wild-type strains can be used. The third is about consultation and public consultation. So there should be transparent public engagement at local, national, and international level that should begin immediately to explore on the acceptability. Fourth is about the coordination between funders, researchers, policymakers, and regulators. And fifth is about site selection. Now here is some concern there because usually these studies are done in high-income countries, but in fact, many of the time, these results have to be generalized to middle to low income countries. So that would be an issue there. And of course, these studies have to be done in strict quarantine sites with strict isolation, and the subjects have to be followed up closely. Six is about participant selection, so as to minimize risk. And then seventh is about that there should be an expert panel to monitor all the tests, so all the study. And lastly is about appropriate and rigorous informed consent process. I think lastly is about the public engagement should be done early on a ready framework, and there's increased calls for just studies to be done in the low to medium income countries. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thanks, CT, for observing the time. I believe we should kind of allow our speakers to kind of express their opinion before we entertain any questions and answers. So our second speaker is Andrew.
Hello, it's great to be here. So what I thought I might do, and it's quite interesting, I wanted to draw people's attention to a document that's just come out this week. And it's a consultation draft, an ethics framework for pandemics. And it's been released by the Australian government, by the National Health and Medical Research Council. And I think it's a very reassuring document. And I guess it's reassuring in the sense that it outlines a very robust framework, not dissimilar to what other speakers have already said. And when we're thinking about the research space and what happens in research, there are already many guidelines, and unfortunately sometimes they can be challenged in times of pandemics. You think of the social scientific validity, you think of fair subject selection, favourable risk-benefit ratio, consent, as has been mentioned, and respect for people. And in Australia, this is kind of encapsulated when we talk about research merit and integrity of research. Justice, as has already been mentioned, beneficence, to do good, and respecting human beings via, as was mentioned, the Kantian categorical imperative. Don't treat people as a mere means, and so on. And also the process of independent review. Now, this is I was really interested in the frameworks that have been presented so far, because this little document here, and it's out for consultation, so I encourage everyone to go to the NHMRC website and have a look and maybe even contribute to it. It covers the public health ethics of a pandemic, which has been covered well in question 1. It covers the clinical resource allocation aspects, and it covers the research. And I guess I'm particularly interested in the research issues because I'm in the practical world, like many of us here. I chair research ethics committees, and during times of pandemics, the researchers are knocking on your door and wanting quick approvals. And there's a whole range of different challenges to those standard issues that I just talked about that are raised. And I thought I'd just mention them from this document here because it captures them reasonably well, and it might stimulate some of our conversation later. So they've got about 10 challenges to research ethics, values and principles. The use of interventions with a limited evidence base. I mean, obviously in pandemic times, even our best epidemiologists and our best researchers, our best clinicians don't have the answers. And so that's a very challenging place. There's a limited evidence base. Approving research on a limited evidence base is a challenging thing for human research ethics committees to do. There may be premature publication of data and outcomes without adequate peer review, which is connected. And the impact of early intervention data could be quite, we've mentioned risk before, but it could be quite harmful to people. The preclinical models aren't as robust as they normally are, so the accelerated pace of research into effective treatment can present challenges re-identifying and obtaining access to appropriate preclinical models. Another issue, process variations for research into vaccine development and other interventions, the health and financial significance of developing a safe and effective vaccine for the disease-causing pandemic increases the pressure to introduce uncontrolled process variations for research, and so on. Another issue, variations in research design, development, review, and conduct to enable pandemic research. We urgently want to get going. Researchers, we urgently need answers. This is going to challenge our normally potentially slow research ethics process. So new measures, the word agile comes to mind, wanting the review process to be speeded up could be challenging. We need to take care. Similar to what was said before in relation to challenge trials. Research prioritization, funding and recruitment. If it's in a time of pandemic, the money can all go to the pandemic. We mustn't forget the research that's needed in other areas as well at this time. Again, another challenge. Research into the impact and responses to the pandemic, they increased dramatically. The amount of COVID-19 research projects that the committees I chair have approved in the last few months is quite astounding. And the quality of that research can vary, of course. Again, another challenge. And finally, and it was mentioned by the last speaker, and it's absolutely correct, consent remains really significantly important, and the risk of what we call therapeutic misconception increases in times of pandemics. Now, all these issues are there all the time, but of course, during times of pandemics, they particularly become challenging. In relation to therapeutic misconception, and I've probably had my 5 minutes, so I'll end on this. Although not specific to the pandemic context, and none of these issues arguably are, but they're neon lighted and highlighted during times of pandemic and other challenges. Issues related to obtaining valid consent to participate in research are heightened. In particular, the potential for exploitation or coercion is accentuated, potentially, and participants' ability to properly assess the risks of the research may well be impeded. And the research experts may not know the answers, making consent itself, information, very challenging. One of the principal ways that the validity of the consent of participants may be compromised is through inadequate attention to the potential for therapeutic misconception, which is the mistaken view that an intervention is primarily designed to directly benefit individual participants as opposed to developing generalizable knowledge for the potential benefit of the community as a whole or selected individuals. And that was, I took that from the Consultation Draft and Ethics Framework for Pandemics, which was released a few days ago. I think it's a really significant document, and sitting alongside what the World Health Organization has said about COVID-19 and challenge studies back in May, I think these are the frameworks that need to guide us. They're inclusive frameworks, and it's an opportunity for all of us to contribute. And I'll say one more thing before I end. People have talked about utilitarianism, the consequences of an action, an agent's actions. We've talked about the principles, the Kantian principle of respecting people's autonomous preferences and so on. There's another big ethical theory, and it's about the virtues. It's about our character. And it was Albert Camus, actually, who reminded us a long time ago that, and in his book, The Plague, that hope is always there during these times, and the most incredible thing that we can learn, or the most significant thing we can learn from when we're challenged in a pandemic, is the ordinary virtues that we see in people through kindness and caring. And so I thought I'd go to the virtues, because we've now covered the three big normative ethics theories. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Then our next speaker is Derek.
Thank you. My work in the past few months has actually more been on developing a set of ethical framework for critical care rationing for public hospitals in Hong Kong. And then next, I have recently looked at the issue of vaccine development and the problem of, or the issues or concerns with pushing for early vaccine availability, sometimes bypassing or short-circuiting the process. But first, I'm going to provide a slightly macroscopic overview of the situation. We know that there are about 180 groups developing vaccines all over the world, and possibly 8 or 9 groups are now in phase 3 stages, phase 3 clinical trial stages. And 4 of the front runners are from mainland China, 1 from Russia, and the rest is from the Western countries or by some joint groups. At least 3 groups, 2 in mainland China and 1 in Russia, have claimed that they have already used the vaccines, provided the vaccines to larger populations outside the clinical phase 3 trials. And I think that is the recent rather intense discussions and also public discussions on the subject. But I'll come to that in a minute. Before that, I have heard and considered a kind of defense for this. So rushing ahead or pushing ahead beyond the normal procedures. One of it, again, is utilitarian, and that is something to do with the urgency of the situation. We know that more than 1 million people have died from COVID in the past 11 months, and likely, if it's uncontrolled, another 1 million will die coming year. Also, there are thousands of healthcare workers who have already died in fighting the battle, and thousands more will die in the coming 12 months. So every delay, quote unquote, delay of making the vaccine available by, say, for 3 to 6 months would mean potentially hundreds and thousands of lives being lost unnecessarily, if you assuming that you can have a safe and effective vaccine that can be widely administered to a large population to save the lives. Okay, so this argument is, I think, sometimes not explicitly discussed as people express their concerns about pushing ahead for the ventures. The other argument is that the current framework of procedures requirements of the phase 3 trials is really not designed for urgent epidemic or pandemic like this. It takes usually 1,000 to 3,000 subjects in phase 3 trials. It takes usually 1.5 to 3 years to complete the trials. So the argument is that you have to do something outside that, okay? And that is where the venture to in the middle of phase 3 trials, the vaccines which are considered to be safe by the developers are already provided freely to populations. Interestingly, I think that mainland China is more in the picture in the news, possibly because the information is a bit more transparent than what is in Russia. So you have more to go by in terms of discussing what is happening there and whether they are concerned. Okay. So my thinking is that granted that these two defenses are to some extent relevant and valid to some extent. I think the concern really is, one, whether as we go ahead to provide the vaccines to a large population outside the clinical trials, whether, number one, there has been adequate informed consent. Again, going back to the idea of whether people do know that this is an experimental vaccine and not a successful vaccine ready to go to the market. Okay, it's quite different to say we have a vaccine now, it's just before going to the market, than saying that the vaccine is still in the experimental stage and we haven't finished the phase 3 trials, and then people would have to understand what phase 3 clinical trials are. So I think informed consent is one aspect. The second aspect is really considering the actual risk and benefit for the population. In a population, in a place where the epidemic is already controlled, the risk of actually acquiring the disease is not high. So the risk and benefit ratio there may be not as favorable as trying out these vaccines in countries where the incidents are still high rampant. Okay. Lastly, the issue is whether, as these ventures are tried outside the clinical phase 3 trials, whether they are possibly open for review, independent review by other groups. Of course, we are now still a bit ahead of ourselves because we are only recently beginning to read about such practice of administrating the populations. And finally, it has to be noted that even if you speed up the process by administering the vaccines to a large population outside the trials, you are at most demonstrating the safety aspects. If you have administered hundreds and thousands, as in mainland China, to the population and you don't find serious adverse events, then you can have some confidence, indirect confidence, that perhaps the vaccine is safe. But that really doesn't tell very much about the efficacy of the vaccine. You're trying it on a large number of people, and unless you have some control study to show that it's effective in lowering the infections, you don't really know anything about the efficacy. Fairly speaking, I think for research teams and companies who are doing providing the vaccine to general population, not some population outside the phase 3 trials, are also in parallel conducting phase 3 trials. So it's not as if they're skipping totally the phase 3 trial. They're trying to argue for the speed of administering to the population. So I'm going to stop here and leave it for the discussions to further consider. Number one, whether it's ever justifiable to speed up the process outside the phase 3 trials. And number two, under what circumstances and by what ethical framework might this be acceptable? Rather than saying that, oh, you have violated the procedure and breached the protocols. I think there's a real issue here of considering when and how it may be acceptable to speed up the process outside the phase 3 trials. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Derek. And may I ask Kirsty to be our last speaker for this session?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, but I'm also, I think, a little bit of an exception to this panel. I am not a philosopher. I did advanced philosophy, believe it or not, when I was younger, but I'm a scientist and I'm a virologist. So what I thought I could contribute to this panel was to give you a sort of first-hand account of some of the ethical questions that we've, as virologists, face working in this field. So just going back to the pandemic, my background is emerging respiratory viral infections, so somewhat well placed for COVID-19. But I have to say, before the start of 2020, my focus was on influenza viruses. So in January, it was already pretty obvious to us that this was going to be a pandemic. I promptly went out and bought my pandemic supplies like a good pandemic virologist. But we really faced the first of many ethical questions that we've never really had to deal with. And the first was, should we start work with this virus? So this is involving live work with the active live infectious virus. And obviously I had concerns about whether or not that was safe, whether or not we had the facilities, whether or not that was safe for my group. And again, not being an ethicist, I didn't have any sort of normative values to guide me. I'm learning a lot of buzzwords tonight. But instead, I sort of had the scientific principles to guide me. So I guess our guiding rule throughout this pandemic has really been, how can I best help this situation? And when I looked at it through that perspective, the answer was relatively easy. I'm one of the few people in the world who has training with these infectious diseases, these respiratory pathogens that have jumped over from animal species. So probably one of the best things that I can do to help the situation is to actually start work with the virus. But then we sort of face other conundrums that some of my colleagues here have alluded to. And it's really about the pace of research that was happening at this point. I was, and I still am, dedicating an hour every day to reading all the new scientific papers that have come out just overnight from Europe and the US in this field, just to stay abreast of all the topics. So we then face this ethical dilemma of, we're investing a lot of time and money and resources into this COVID-19 research. And yes, it's for the public good, but we also need to think about our careers and our future, and funding is finite. So how do we balance that, getting research out quickly and making sure that we're not scooped, and making sure that it's good, high quality research that's reproducible? And again, we sort of go back to this principle of, how could I best help this situation? And really, the best way I could help the situation was not necessarily being the first to publish something. And you know, this took me a little while to accept as somebody who's in quite a competitive field, but being somebody who can publish authentic, quality research. And I think this was the first time that I really felt the pressure and the implications of getting it wrong. And I'll give you an example of this. Very early on in the pandemic, we were researching the role of children in the spread of the virus, because we know that in influenza pandemics, children play a key role in transmitting infectious virus. But all the signs were pointing to something different with COVID-19. And so we did the research, and our research suggested that children were not playing a major role in spreading the virus, and that in terms of lockdowns, opening schools should be the #1 priority where possible. You know, they should be the first things to open, ahead of pubs, ahead of restaurants, ahead of everything else, for a variety of reasons. Now, I have never felt the pressure of publishing something like that, because that was being used to advise policy. And I'm a basic scientist by training. I'm lucky if any of my research gets translated. So again, to me, the guiding ethical principle here is, the best way I can help this situation is making sure that the information that I'm disseminating is correctly guiding policy. So that's one of the ways that we have dealt with this ethical conundrum, I suppose, we face, of rapidity versus reproducibility. The other thing I want to touch on a little bit is being asked to advise on things like vaccine trials, on the utility of live challenge experiments, as has been touched on by my colleagues. And I'm going to do this very briefly because I know we're over the time and I'm the last speaker. But again, the guiding principle here for me is not an ethical one, but it's really about, how do we make sure we get the most accurate scientific information out of these trials? And so for me, the life challenge experiments, yes, there's considerations about patients' health and the ethics of that, but I'm actually not in favor of these trials because we cannot get the best scientific information out of them. Specifically, you would be doing these live challenge experiments in young, healthy individuals. And really, that's not the population we need to be targeting. We need to be targeting vulnerable patient groups, so the elderly, those with underlying conditions. So independent of the ethics of whether or not these individuals will get sick, whether or not there's long-term effects of that, which is a whole other question, it's not going to give you the best scientific information. Similarly with vaccine trials, yes, things are being sped up and it's absolutely incredible the rapidity at which this is happening. But again, the so-called shortcuts that are being taken, I find very reassuringly, are not those that will affect the scientific integrity of the study. Namely, the shortcuts are things in bureaucracy. The shortcuts are things like vaccine manufacturers are placing a big gamble on whether or not the vaccine will work by going into vaccine production before the end of phase 3 clinical trials. And again, I'm very reassured recently with the FDA coming out saying that they're actually going to uphold a lot of the sort of standard vaccine practices in terms of measuring efficacy and not try to push out a vaccine before a certain election deadline. So I think that as a scientist, it's a very bizarre situation to be in, to have to grapple with all these ethics questions. And certainly when I was studying ethics and microbiology and immunology, people thought I was absolutely crazy for trying to do an arts degree and a science degree. And people said, why would you ever do that? And I think this situation emphasizes why we as scientists need to have an understanding of the ethics of the situation, but also we can use our guiding scientific framework to help guide our own ethics and decisions. So I'm just going to end it there, just to ensure that we have enough time for some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. And Jeff, should I pass the time to you for the next panel discussion?
I think, Francis, what we'll do, we've got about 11 minutes till our sign finishes. We might work through some questions, and we might, question 3 has some bits, but we have had one question coming through on the chat line and on the question line, which is to Melanie. And the question is around, has the policy of ICU actually ever been challenged? And it was actually talking about challenged by the general public, politicians, but I suppose legally would be the other part.
Yeah, I've answered that one in writing, but I'll just quickly say now that it's been really, we tried not to use categories so much. The only ones that have tended to be used are in some guidelines or age and healthcare worker status, and they've been restricted to being tiebreakers between people who have equal clinical priority. And there's also been some work done around the idea that taking chronic comorbidity into account in clinical priority tools actually does discriminate against socially disadvantaged people and people with disabilities, because at baseline they have worse health. So actually some of the guidelines have even taken chronic comorbidity out of their clinical priority tools unless they think it'll affect mortality in the next month. So it has been challenged, and I think people are mostly wanting to stay away from categories, and when they are used, they're in very specific circumstances.
Thanks, Melanie. So are there any questions in between the panelists? Just because we had a very rich discussion before because there's a couple of things that I can probably raise, but are there questions between our panelists? So we've got a question, is the group consensus a more important consideration for non-utilitarian ethical solutions? Oh.
I might have a crack at answering that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I could.
I think that, I mean, what's been interesting watching the US is, there's a lot of sort of pushback from sort of basically right-wing anarchist groups who are using the language of rights and freedom, but they're kind of they're only getting half of the equation there in that, that sort of rights-based discourse, because of course the correlative of a right is an obligation, and rights invariably create obligations, in particular not to infringe the rights of others or to harm others. And so what's been lacking from that whole sort of discussion, both in the US, but also here as well, as any discussion around the social contract, where we collectively agree to abide by certain, laws and moral principles that themselves have to be made acceptable to all those whom they affect. So I think actually what we need is more discussion about the social contract, and that's where this idea of consensus building comes in.
Andrew?
I could just make a comment in relation to the research process, because one of the things that in Australia we have a national statement and it emphasises those 4 values and principles that I talked about earlier, research merit and integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect for humans. But of course, when a decision is made by a committee about a particular project or a particular issue that they're discussing, consensus is the way to go. And the diversity of views and the diversities of people's approach to different issues and the argument there is everything. So for me, one ethics theory will not guide what is right or wrong. The ethics theories are tools to help us justify our actions. And consensus is, for me, is definitely the way to go. And, you know, I used to go work for NHMRC for a while, and I used to go around, and there are 250 ethics committees in this country, human research ethics committees, and most of them, we used to observe them, we used to certify them and all this sort of thing, but most of them don't have a vote. Some do, but very, very few. Consensus is the way it works. And for me, I think that question is really significant. And you can apply it outside of the research space as well, of course, but, you know, consensus, diversity of view is definitely very important to me.
Could I add just really quickly to that, Andrew, is that I think consensus is, you know, necessary but not sufficient for a good decision. So I think you mentioned diversity, and I think all those things about procedural justice and diverse views and a good rational process need to happen, and consensus at the end.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Partisanship, of course, is a challenging problem in all of this. And, you know, when you see what's happening in the United States and even in Australia with some people, and politicians, of course, get captured by partisanism and partisanship, it's not helpful, though, is it? It's not helpful.
So, Melanie, while you have the partial Zoom floor, do you want to ask your question about lean bureaucracy, which I'm quite keen on myself?
Yes, as Kirsty said, reassured us that most of the rapidity of new research being funded and approved is due to cutting bureaucracy. And I think just in terms of future-proofing the system, to take something out of the third question that we were hoping to get to, do you think we could keep this new lean bureaucracy for research?
100%. Look, I'm a bit of an optimist, and I think there are going to be some really positive things that come out of this pandemic, and certainly in the way in which we do science. And I think as scientists and as a scientific research community, we've learnt multiple things. The first is that it can be done. So all this idea of, oh, it's too hard, it's going to take too long, there's too many forms, there's too much, you know, we just leave that research there. No, we can actually achieve something if we put our minds to it, and we can have a leaner and more efficient system. The second thing that I hope we learn out of this pandemic is that the advancement of science is not an individual effort, and far too often I think people forget this, but that the real scientific advances, and the best example of this is all the vaccines being developed, come through teams, come through diverse, multinational, multidisciplinary teams. And that's the way that science is going to proceed and succeed moving forward. And then I think the third thing that hopefully we have learned as scientists out of this is that communication is key. Because if we as scientists aren't communicating, if politicians aren't communicating, if there is a disconnect between the different members of our society that are meant to do the different jobs, nothing works. So I'm very optimistic, maybe naively so, that out of this pandemic will perhaps come a leaner, more efficient and more effective scientific system.
Kirsty, I'm with you. I'm an optimist as well, and I think we're going to learn a lot. I mean, in the scientific realm, but in many other aspects of what we do, that we do need to collect, because I am quite worried that we'll revert to the mean rather than kind of collecting the things that actually are truly effective in that area. And in terms of communication, it's interesting, as probably science and statistics, or numbers anyway, have been discussed more than ever before. You know, it is really this sort of notion of literacy, health literacy and so on, has really been brought into stark relief. You know, we've got a big gap there around the communication, and we have to take responsibility for some of that, I'm sure.
May I bring up a question to here? views from the panels, and that is on the question of when you consider consensus on certain issues. Do you go for a universal kind of consensus like WHO coordinated global consensus, or does consensus mean allowing for a lot of local consensus, for instance, in vaccine allocation or in ICU rationing? It's quite different to have consensus which is Australian, China, versus consensus which is coordinated or agreed upon in WHO kind of setting.
Any comments on that?
I just wanted to make one observation. I said during my talk that we don't, as a matter of fact, value lives equally. And there was a project that came out of MIT. It was called Moral Machines, and it related to automated, driverless cars. And they were, they have to make these, they have to sort of design these machines so they make these hard choices in forced choice situations, right? Where you either have to, kill one person. They're like trolley problems. You either have to sort of hit one person or you have to hit, 3 people and they did this global survey involving something like 40 million responses across 230 odd countries, and they found, what was interesting to me was that they found these differences in how people respond to the question depending on which country they belong to. Some people some people would sort of always protect the child rather than the adult, but not all countries. Some countries would protect more rather than less. Some countries would sort of sacrifice the elderly. And anyway, there was lots of kind of cultural variation in the results, which was fascinating to me. And so if we think about, what kind of intergenerational contracts or principles we're going to, to operate by when we have to make these really hard choices, the fact is there is this cultural variation, but then there's this normative question whether that should influence our decision-making or not. And that seems less clear.
Well, thanks, Deborah. That might be a good place for us to end. I note we're at 7:30 here and 5:30, I think, in Hong Kong. So can I thank the organisers of this, both on the CUHK side and the UQ side. I know these things are a lot of work and so on, and thank everybody for that. I'd like to thank our panellists, who I think have given us an enormous amount of food for thought, and I think I need to watch the video back so that I can gain everything. But Deborah, Andrew, Melanie, Kirsty, Derek, CT, and Roger. A lot of the time we do these ethics forums in kind of hypothetical mode, and it's interesting now we can do something that actually relates to the real-time ethical dilemmas that we're doing, and I think there's a certain edge to it all when we start to quote these things. So on behalf of UQ, thank you for your participation, and for all of those that are online. I think we've still got 80 odd people online. Thank you for participating, and I'll hand over for the final thanks to my colleague, Francis.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I believe on behalf of my colleagues from CUHK, I really want to thank not only our speakers, but for all the panelists from University of Queensland. You have done a marvelous job. And last but not least, I really want to thank Dr. Gallagher for making this very exciting event possible. And I agree with Jeff. In the past, we talk about things that are really theoretical, but we are really dealing with something that is so important and affecting everybody. And I don't have enough time because we've passed 5:30 p.m. in Hong Kong already. Otherwise, I would like to ask a few more questions to Kirsty and a few others. But I do look forward to the opportunity to have similar webcast, and if possible, with face-to-face discussion on this very interesting topic in the near future. So once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
All right. Okay. Good
Thank
night.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.